So before we go ahead and start up our virtual machine, we'll need to configure it a little bit. So the first thing you're going to want to do is click on the virtual machine, highlighted the one that you've just created, and go ahead and click on Settings. You're going to pop up a huge dialog of all sorts of different options and settings to help configure your virtual machine. In the General tab, you have things like name, type, and version that we've already said. We've got things like Advanced and Description as well. A Description tab will allow you to write a simple description for your virtual machine. Under the Advanced tab, you'll have technical options like mini toolbar configuration, removable media, and you'll have like a shared clipboard which you can enable as you would please. In the Systems tab, we have technical stuff like memory, RAM, like we've configured earlier, and like I've said, you can configure this later on after creating the virtual machine at any time. The only thing is you have to shut down the virtual machine, change this, and then restart it, and you'll be able to have access to it. But it is definitely changeable at any point. It is not permanent when creating the virtual machine. Under the display, you'll have video memory and monitor count and extended features and a bunch of advanced features that you'll have for configuring that, as well as a remote display to allow access to remotely access the virtual machine, through a server of sorts. Storage. Now, this is the important part. This is where you're going to point the virtual machine to the setup for the installation files for the operating system. So in this configuration, you're going to point the virtual machine. You're going to point VirtualBox to the installation files to the setup for the operating system. In my case, I was giving you an example of setting up a Linux virtual machine, and I have a Linux ISO, a Linux distribution ISO disk image that I'm going to be ready to use so that I can set up a new Linux virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and click on storage, click on empty on the under next to this CD icon. You're going to see empty. You're going to see CD DVD drive IDE second master. You can use a CD from the CD drive, or you can use a file. In my case, I already have a file set up here. You can click on choose it, and you'll be able to choose the directory in which you'll find the ISO. And so in that case, I have the ISO already configured there. And now the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go back to System. Click on the System tab. You're going to see Motherboard, and you're going to see this boot order option. And the thing is, since I'm using an ISO file, which is technically considered a CD, DVD file, according to VirtualBox, you're going to want to change that boot order so that it may go up. So you can see these up and down arrows. I'm going to place CD, DVD up one, and I'm going to place floppy down at the bottom, and I can also disable it. So that way there will be no need for confusion here. It's not going to need to look for floppies because I don't use floppies. I'm not using a network resource, and we will be using the hard disk later on once we have the operating system installed, but we haven't installed the operating system yet. So we're going to want the CD, DVD, ROM option as the top priority boot order. So make sure you have that selected before you fire up the virtual machine. There are other options that I can go through later on that are more sophisticated but are not mandatory to be configured at this time for setting up the virtual machine to install the operating system. So now let's go ahead and start up our virtual machine. You're going to need to select the virtual machine that you've created and you've configured. Make sure it's highlighted blue, and then you press the green start button, and then it's going to load. Give it a second to start up, and it'll go through the procedure. Now this is the Linux Mint boot screen as if you're running it from a CD for the very first time. I'm going to press enter, and I'm going to press enter again to start up my Linux Mint distribution, and the setup will go from here, and I will be given the option to install the virtual machine, or the virtual operating system, in this case Linux Mint 14, into the virtual machine. So there's one other thing I should say before I leave you from this tutorial. Installation varies from virtual machine to from virtual operating system to virtual operating system. So depending on the operating system you chose to install in a virtual machine, your setup's going to be a little bit different. So therefore, I can't really show you fully what the installation is going to look like because it varies from operating system to operating system. But there is one more setting that I must show you before I leave you. With all these tutorials in place, there's one setting that you need to look into after you have the operating system installed. You only change this once the operating system has been installed. Once the operating system has been installed, you will go ahead and I'm gonna have to close this operating system here, and I'm gonna go ahead and power off this machine, and I will go into the settings and show you this operating system, this virtual machine setting that you'll need to change after you have the operating system installed. You do not want, after I assume that once you've finished installing the operating system, you don't want to go back into the operating system setup. So in order to avoid it automatically, the virtual machine starting up every time automatically to the setup, you're going to want to go ahead and go into the system, and you can just go ahead and change the boot order. The CD-ROM, you can lower it down, and the hard disk will be the number one thing. And to be safe, you could just disable the CD-ROM boot order option altogether, so it won't boot up to that anymore. The other way, now this is another option. You have another way of doing it, entirely different from this, or, but just another option is to go into the storage option and click on the setup file that you'll see. This is the setup file's name, and you can just go ahead and release it altogether. You can click remove disk from virtual drive right there, and that way it won't lead to any setup file for the operating system at all anymore, and it'll default straight into the virtual machine disk, which hopefully if you set up right and you've installed correctly, it would have installed to that file, and that from that point, forward, every time booting up the virtual machine, it'll go to the hard disk, and the operating system has already been installed, and you can continue going from there. So that's the one last piece of advice I want to give you before I leave you. Thank you very much for watching. Hey guys, and I just wanted to add one more suggestion. There are a whole bunch of other settings that are available to configure from each virtual machine. And by the way, configuring some settings for one virtual machine will not affect another virtual machine. That meaning that the settings you configure for one virtual machine will be set for that one virtual machine, and that every time you create a new virtual machine after that, it will have its own settings independent of the other virtual machines that you have created. So just want to make sure that you understand that. And there are a bunch of other settings in there. Obviously, there are a ton of settings that you can use to configure your virtual machine that I've not explained and I've not gone through. And I'd just like to say that for the most part, you probably won't need most of those settings, but if you are curious about what those settings do and how they affect your virtual machine, I recommend you check out the documentation. The VirtualBox website has great documentation explaining all the different features and settings available in VirtualBox. So if you're really curious, I recommend you go check out the documentation on the VirtualBox website at virtualbox.org. Anyways, that's all I'd like to say for now. Thank you for watching.